Hi, it's great to be here. My name is Matt Leavitt. I'm an agronomist with a seed company based in Albert Lea, Minnesota called Albert Lea Seed. And I can tell you it definitely feels like spring here because when I left, we just got, you know, 12 inches of snow dumped on us. So this is great. Um, and what I do specifically, I do some baseline agronomy for Albert Lea Seed. But the main thing I'm going to talk about today is our pipeline of organic cover crop seed. We ship organic cover crop seed all over the nation just because there's a lot less framework in total seed production for that sort of stuff. So we'll ship organic cover crop seed across the nation. We are located in Minnesota, so the primary circle of our seed goes from Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, Iowa, but it's a range. So what I'll talk about is kind of the more of a large-scale perspective of how we produce seed, what our pipeline is, and what we've seen in terms of growth in organic cover crops. And a little bit is, I'm glad Ray mentioned winter rye. I'm going to kind of use that as an example of taking it down to the farm scale and showing how a producer could produce organic cover crop seed on their farm. And I'll use winter rye as an example because it's a good relatively easy crop to grow, and it fits into a lot of rotations no matter what your overall farming style is. And then I'll just touch on a little bit on where we're going in terms of a business and some of the challenges we see with availability and kind of rolling out crops. So we've been in business since 1923. We started supplying organic cover crop seed or organic seed in general in 1999. We produced our first crop of organic oats and we sold none of them. We're kind of stupid and we're slow learners, and we've kept at it, and because of that we've grown to offer a lot of different range of seed, primarily farm seed, so anything from soup to nuts really. And when we're dealing with cover crops, that fits very gradually into the organic rotation, because by NOP rules your farms are a lot more diverse, and cover crops kind of fit into that very nicely. There's a lot of different places you can fit cover crop seed into your rotation, and we as a company have seen a lot of demand increase over the last 4 to 5 years as well. Increased adoption of cover crops. You can't open a farm journal or even a conventional farm publication without reading some article about cover crops, new cover crop species, and how great they are. And I might say, just selfishly from a seed company perspective, is that there's not many seed outfits out there that are dealing in organic cover crop seed. So we're kind of the beneficiaries of that in some perverse way, because we're shipping that seed to you folks out in Washington, out to the East Coast. So that limited pipeline of availability kind of plays into that too in terms of our demand. But we are rolling out new species and mixes every year. And I tend to find my background was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. And I really feel like every year I learn just as much from producers on the ground in terms of what's working well, what's not. And we're continually kind of retooling our mixes and our species to reflect what's going to best serve the farming community. In general, availability-wise, we do kind of have all of the seed available that one would find in conventional, with some pretty notable exceptions. But where are we sourcing growing seed? We're not farming ourselves, so we're contracting either with farmers or we're buying it wholesale. And it just totally depends where we're sourcing it from. Some stuff is viable to grow in the upper Midwest. Small grains, hairy vetch, clovers, buckwheat, soybeans, we can all do fine at. Other stuff like alfalfa, field peas, or sorghum sudan grass, or radishes, or annual ryegrass, which is kind of more in this part of the country. It's just not feasible to grow, or there's not the equipment and know-how to be able to do that. So as I mentioned, we're contracting with farmers to raise these seed crops, and it really is, Ray mentioned this earlier, but it is a specialized set of knowledge. You got to not only know how to be a good organic producer, but you have to have the proper equipment to harvest, to store, to clean the seed. And you also have to be well versed in raising seed crops. So it's kind of, it is a specialized set of knowledge if you want to jump into raising organic seed. But in terms of our pipeline of farmers that we'll contract with, we'll contract the acres with them. We'll source the seed stock, and it just totally depends on where that's going to come from. You know, if you're talking about something like cereal rye, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, there's not really a whole lot of registered IP blue tag winter rye out there. So a lot of the rye bought and sold is all white tag, variety not stated. But if we're going to produce, say, Wheeler rye from Michigan, we actually go through the Crop Improvement Association pipeline of getting foundation seed from the university and field certifying that field so it is true to type and it's identity preserved. So then we'll bring in the seed, we'll clean it, we're going to test it before and after for purity and germination, and then we're going to store it, bag it, and then we'll send it out. So if anyone in the audience is interested in growing organic cover crop seed, kind of a first basic question to ask is, you know, why do you want to grow it, and who is your market for the end product? You know, is it seed that you're going to use on your own farm? Is this seed that you're going to sell or trade with other local farmers? Or is this something you're going to contract with a seed company like ours to kind of put that into the retail pipeline? And you know, obviously you want to source something that's going to be successful on your own farming operation, you know, whether it's correct species or species that are going to work with your rotation. You know, the time and the energy has to be worth it for you to put in the crop so it's profitable at the end. And you know, there's lots of different categories of seed that one could produce viably. You know, small grains are definitely you know, achievable on a small scale. Buckwheat, hairy vetch, peas, and other vetches are definitely achievable on a small scale. Kind of more out here, we're looking into more of the brassicas and the grasses as well. So I'm going to focus on winter rye too, in terms of, you know, kind of a good benchmark species of something that, you know, someone could feasibly produce on your farm. And, you know, kind of a basic question is, you know, can I raise winter cereal rye on my farm? Do I know how to do it, or do I have a neighbor or a mentor that can kind of guide me on how to plant it, how to harvest it, how to store it, how to clean it? Does it fit in my crop rotation? All just kind of basic questions that, you know, would need to be answered. And then, you know, once you raise the stuff and you clean it and go through all that process, do you have a market for it at the end? Is this seed for your own use, or are you going to sell it to someone else? And does it make economic sense? You know, if you put in the time and the energy, is it worth the trouble after all the time that you spend on it? Because, you know, it is a specialized set of knowledge, and it does take quite a bit of time to get it correct. And keeping it pure, storing it, cleaning out all of your equipment before and after. And, you know, kind of another basic question is, can I make more money by growing something else versus cover crops? But just in terms of basics, you know, in the upper Midwest, winter cereal rye is a winter annual. So it's something that you plant in the fall and then would overwinter. I'm probably not telling you something that you don't already know. And then, you know, it would grow up in the spring and you'd harvest it. Typically in the upper Midwest, it's often swathed and put in a windrow and then picked up with a combine just to kind of maintain more uniformity of the grain and maturity versus trying to direct combine it. And as Ray mentioned, seeding rate is really important, you know, getting a good stand of seed out there. You know, we have much harsher winters in the upper Midwest, and winter rye has no trouble surviving the winter. So I think it would work great out here for sure. And there's a range, you know, it's planted in late fall, you plant it 1 inches deep. And you don't obviously want to plant it before or after any small grains are going to come up, just to maintain kind of seed purity. You don't want wheat or oats or barley in your winter rye because it's tough to clean out. And also kind of important to think about, you know, what crop is going to come after a winter cereal rye crop for seed. Winter rye can be really greedy for nitrogen and for water. So just kind of keep that in mind with what your soil type is like and what crop is going to come after that. And, you know, typically, you know, 50 bushels to the acre of rye seed is a darn good yield. But you know, it's more typically somewhere in that 20 to 40 bushels to the acre range. And part of this is the reason that I mentioned before. It's just there's not a lot of identity preserved winter rye planted out there. So really, that yield can range a lot because you're not really sure what material you're starting with in terms of an actual true to type seed. So where would you get the seed stock? You know, you could get it from a company like ours. You could source it from a crop improvement association. That's where we work very closely with the Minnesota Crop Improvement Association to do the identity preserve process on a lot of seed, and that would have a blue tag on it, and it has to go through a whole other process of getting certified seed from the breeding programs and making sure that that seed is pure throughout. Or you could get it through a small private breeding program. There are a few companies out there privately breeding winter rye, but there's not many of them, and they're mainly in Canada. And does the seed stock need to be organic? Not necessarily, but it's always something that one should check with their organic certifier for before planting any seed stock. So I've already kind of beat this to death a little bit. You know, I didn't mention anything about variety selection because there's just not a lot of breeding work being done on winter rye, and that's starting to change relatively recently, where universities in the upper Midwest are getting more involved in breeding winter rye, kind of releasing new varieties, and that's really where we see a lot of good development work yet to be done to breed cover crop specific varieties for particular purposes. So that's something we're going to continue to invest in, and something we're kind of excited about as a company to actually offer IP varieties to folks for specific purposes. You know, whether it's early emerging winter rye, or you know, early maturing, or maybe it's rye that gets really tall so you can smash it down with a roller crimper. All those uses are definitely out there and need to be bred for. So, I mean, plant it, obviously, you want to make sure the planter's clean, mapping and marking your fields very well to make sure there's, you know, good isolation there. In the summer, controlling weeds as much as you can. You know, with something like winter rye, it's sort of like you plant it and cross your fingers. But you can, there is certain pieces of weed control equipment you can use, like tine weeder. Some people have used that around us to control early season weeds in emerging rye. But a good solid seed and adequate seeding rate is probably your best insurance against weed escapes. And you know, with harvesting, making sure again everything is clean on the combine, the augers, wagons, and handling equipment is all cleaned out and spick and span. The storage bins are clean. We use, when we clean out our storage bins on site, we spray the insides with liquid DE just to minimize pest pressure, because it does a good job on some of the troublesome insects that we have with seed. And managing moisture, as Ray mentioned too, is really, really critical. We like to see seed come in between, you know, about 11 and 13%. And just kind of as an aside too, we have had some folks in the past. Question?
Yeah, what's liquid DE?
Oh, sorry, it's diatomaceous earth. So it's basically like ancient small-shelled animals, but it's like a powder.
Like cat litter.
Yeah. So it's crushed up shells, and it kind of pierces the bodies of soft-bodied insects and prevents them from.
You can get good deal on it.
Yeah, I mean we use food grade labeled DE, so I suppose you could eat this stuff if you wanted to, but so if you're harvesting grain, or if it's a little bit wet, or if you're harvesting in the morning, we have had some periodic issues over the years with folks harvesting grain, putting it in a bin or in a wagon or a bin, and then putting a tarp over it. So critical to let the grain breathe and not to seal it in a plastic bag, because the grain can spoil and it can actually get hotter and more moist in that sort of environment. So it needs to breathe, and ideally you'd store it in a bin with aeration under it, just to maintain a constant airflow and to dry that grain down. So then your next step would be to take a sample for testing. This is less important if you're kind of selling to your neighbor and you have a good relationship, and they're kind of taking your word for it. But if you're selling retail, you do have to follow more federal and state seed law, where you'd have to have a purity and germination test. You'd have to have proper tagging and bagging and all that information. You'd have to have a noxious weed component. And I showed an example of one of our blue tags up here, and all that information would be on there. Where it was grown, what the germination is, if there's any noxious weeds in there, seeds per pound, etc. So after we get that information, then we'd proceed to clean it and package it and label it. Not going to go into this too much because I think I'm running out of time, but the main things we would use in-house to clean winter rye would be a fanning mill. How many people in here have a fanning mill? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard farm equipment. You can find them relatively easily. It does a fairly good job on most small grains. That's the first step in our pipeline. So that's separating stuff based on density and size. And it's 5,000-year-old technology. It still works great. We have fanning mills that we run all the time. Sometimes we'll also use an indent cylinder to clean grain, and that's cleaning stuff based on length. So it's good to clean stuff like that have different seed lengths. So, for example, oats and wheat, or oats and hairy vetch, or something that has a distinct difference in length. And then occasionally for something like winter rye, we'd use a gravity table, which basically operates like an air hockey table. There's air pushed up through the bottom, and the heavy stuff falls to the bottom, and the light stuff, whether it's infected grain with scab or ergot or broken grain, will kind of slide to the top, and then it'll go one way, and the good grain will go in another bin. So just kind of some things that we use. So just to kind of wrap up here, what we see in terms of cover crop seed availability is there is a lack of specified region-appropriate cover crop seed varieties. And this is really what I've been coming back to a few times. That there's just a lack of varieties that are bred for specific use for cover cropping, just because there's not a lot of money and infrastructure to support that. But it is changing. And certain species are just notoriously difficult to produce organically. Something that we see that's kind of a need is organic crimson clover, organic millet, dwarf Essex rape, turnips. Trying to think. Some of the other legumes, cowpeas, lupins, stuff like that. There is definitely a need and a shortage of that stuff produced in a certified organic context. And the main issues we run into with organic cover crop seed production, typically mirror what most organic operations are already struggling with. Probably number one being weeds. And it's not necessarily problematic because the weeds are commingled with the seeds. It's mainly an issue of seed size, where the weeds are difficult to clean out. And that's really where the issue comes in. For example, we produce a lot of barley in North and South Dakota, and they have a really big issue with field bindweed, and that's a really tough weed to separate out from barley. And it's also a noxious weed for us too. So if there's even one field bindweed seed in a bag of barley, it doesn't pass muster. So that kind of plays into seed quality too. Availability can be an issue sometimes, depending on what the species is. And for a lot of folks out here, shipping costs are high. Our prices for organically produced winter rye range from, $17 to $20 per 50-pound bag, but you tack on, $300 to $400 in shipping after shipping it halfway across the country. And seed like that is very bulky, so you're definitely paying by the pound for that. So that's an issue, and there's just not a lot of companies like ours out there kind of spread around the country to really meet that need. But I should say, on a hopeful note, that I think things are changing, and we're trying to support those efforts as much as we can by donating money and kind of helping this process move along. There is breeding work starting to be done at University of Minnesota. They conducted their first winter rye variety trial this past year. They trialed, I think it was 30 to 35 different varieties sourced from all over, so US, Canada, just to kind of do some baseline evaluation work of, what's the maturity of these varieties, what do they yield, agronomic characteristics, that sort of thing. So just kind of good baseline knowledge. I mean, a lot of baseline breeding work on winter rye hasn't really been advanced beyond the 1970s or 80s. Same thing with hairy vetch. They've kind of started to do some work breeding that for enhanced winter hardiness in our environment, evaluating different radishes. And recently, University of Wisconsin hired a cover crops breeding postdoc. Some of you may be familiar with her. It's Lisa Kitzing-Kushik. And she came from Cornell, so that's exciting too. And just in terms of us, we're going to continue to fund cover crop research and breeding work. We think it's important, and it helps our farmers at the end. So we think it's worth it. And we're going to continue to kind of evaluate our lineup and work to bring on new species and varieties and new mixes too. That's kind of a big way of where we're going. So I'll kind of end with a plug here. If anybody in here grows organic cover crop seed, or if that's something you're interested in, please talk to me. I have a booth out there, and be interested to just hear your thoughts and at least make some contacts there, because we are looking for, especially in this area, localized production of mainly brassicas that we don't have a good supply of organically. So dwarf Essex rape, turnips, grasses, and some other stuff too. So with that, thanks for having me here. It's been great to meet folks here and to kind of be out of my element a little bit, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So the question was, is the seed cleaning centralized and decentralized? It's both. We have our own cleaning plant where we have 2 different lines with different equipment, but we also do some cleaning, farmer-driven cleaning as well. It just kind of is totally crop specific or grower specific if they have the equipment and kind of the setup to do it at their place. So it's both. Yeah, so the question was, is there people growing multiple species of cover crops to harvest at the end and harvest together? Yeah, absolutely. It typically doesn't get more diverse than 2 crops. The ones I can think of right off the top of my head are winter rye and hairy vetch are really easy companions to grow together, and it's really easy to separate them out at the end. The other thing would be barley and peas, or oats and peas. So spring field peas and either barley or oats. Again, really easy to grow together and to kind of separate out. I'm not familiar with any other, 3-way mixes or 4-way mixes that would be suitable for that kind of environment to separate them out at the end. Yeah, the question was if we produce seed out in here, would it have to come all the way back to Minnesota? Yeah, I guess it would depend. Part of it is our own knowledge base with cleaning stuff like turnips. I don't think to my knowledge, that we've cleaned stuff like that. So it may be a case where we'd send it to another more specific small seed plant or broker it that way. But I guess it would just depend based on what the crop is. Yeah, the question was, do I know any cover crop producers in the Southwest? I don't personally know. And you've raised a very good point. It's just one of the issues we continue to run into. We just get killed on the shipping just because it's bulky stuff and it's going a long way. So no, I don't. And if anybody knows of anybody, I'm happy to connect you with them, but I don't personally. All right, thanks.